Hello, this is Lisa Cherry on the podcast, and I am very excited, as per usual, because today I'm joined with Nick Hardwick. Now, by way of introduction, let me just introduce Nick because I had to go on Wikipedia to find out as much as I possibly could about Nick. So, he was the chief executive of the charity Centrepointe. He was Chief Exec of Refugee Council, Chair of the Independent Police Complaints Commission, Her Majestys Chief Inspector of Prisons, which I think sounds very grand. He has a CBE and was the Chair of the Parole Board for England and Wales in March 2016. Hello, good morning, Nick.
Hello, Lisa. How nice to see you again.
I know, isn't it fantastic? And I don't even know where we're going to start today, but I suppose when I looked at the Wikipedia introduction, I normally ask somebody, but I thought, I know it's all there, so I'm going to go over there and just see what they've put. It looked like you kind of left uni and then just became a CEO.
No. I had a very disreputable time at university, and left by the skin of my teeth with a third-class degree, leaving a trail of chaos in my wake. And at that time, I wanted to be a journalist, actually. And I thought the best way to do it was to apply for join a local paper after I left. So I was busy doing that. In the meantime, I got a summer job, so I thought, working with young offenders, boys and girls, it was, who'd come out of Borsals and detention centres as they were then. So this was in the early 1980s. And I just planned to do that over the summer. And the idea was to help them, get a job, all of that kind of stuff. But I stuck doing that for 6 years. I realise actually now, looking back, that the people who set the scheme up also thought I was unemployable. That's why they let me get onto it. But anyhow, so I did that for 6 years, working with young people. And then if they were homeless, which a lot of them were, we used to send them up to Centrepointe, which had a night shelter. So I knew a bit about Centrepointe. And when the job came up there, I applied for it. And at that time, Centrepointe was just a very small project. But pretty soon after I got there, the sort of youth homeless crisis really took off in a way that I think even now, with all that's going on, people would find shocking. You did have, young people aged 16, very young, actually sleeping on the streets and at real kind of risk. And as that kind of crisis developed, Centrepointe expanded, and I had opportunities. I was given a lot of responsibility, and I had opportunities and challenges that otherwise wouldn't have got.
So from it sounds like chaotic departure from university, you, within a very short space of time, worked your way up into quite a high level of responsibility at Centrepointe.
Yes, but I think it wasn't. I don't think it was I wasn't ambitious in that sense. It was just stuff that was happening around me that I had to respond to, really. So it was chance, I think, that I ended up in the roles that I did.
And how did that kind of, we will revisit Centrepointe later on, but how did that kind of segue into then the Refugee Council and then really spending a lot of time in the prison service?
Well, certainly then at the Refugee Council, I was at Centrepointe a long time. I was there 9 years, grew a lot during that time. And towards the end of that period, we were starting to see unaccompanied refugee children arrive at Centrepointe. Who were also homeless and on the streets, and that was so this was in the kind of early 1990s by this point, and you were starting to see the sort of first really kind of large-scale refugee movements following the kind of end of the Cold War, all of that kind of stuff. And in particular, we were seeing young people from the Horn of Africa, from Ethiopia and Eritrea, and they were turning up at the night shelter, with no one to care for them, completely bemused. So that way I found out about the Refugee Council's work, and then when a job came up there, it was kind of time to move. And again, I think, it was luck. So I was at the Refugee Council, and then in the early 2000s, at that point, Blair government, which is a good thing, I think, Blair government did do some good things. we're trying to recruit people from the voluntary sector and community sector to go and work in government, go and work in the statutory sector. And so I applied to set up rather naively, I think, because I didn't know what was involved, set up the IPCC. And rather to my amazement, got the job.
Well, it's amazing, really. And can you just tell me a little bit about what it means to be Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons? Because that sounds like, I've done some work within criminal justice, and one of the things that really strikes me is how rigid it is and how inflexible it is, and how informed by compliance and rules and ways of doing things it is. I mean, is that a fair representation? Was that what you found?
Well, I think that there's a lot in there. I mean, I think, as with lots of organisations, there's a sort of way they are supposed to be, which is rule-bound, structured. You could draw a lovely, and people do, theoretical description of how the criminal justice system works, with sort of lines showing things logically connecting and rules that are consistently applied. And then, as with any other organisational system, actually it's a kind of mass of contradictions and chaos, with people making, trying, I think, often to make good decisions, but in pretty chaotic circumstances. So I think, and that's particularly true of prisons. And I think certainly for prisons, I thought the key thing, prisons are and other places of detention are such closed worlds. I thought one of the key things I had to do was try and explain to people outside what was going on behind the walls in their name, and who was there and what was really happening, which is it was a very shocking, very disturbing. It's a very disturbing world, prison world.
And we've got that a lot at the moment. We've got 2 programs running on different channels that are allegedly showing us the inside of life in prison through the lens of the people recording that. Have you watched those?
Yeah, I have watched those. I mean, I think they are. I've been quite struck, actually. I think they are a fair description of those prisons, and those prisons are not completely exceptional, but they're not the whole picture. I mean, I was up in a prison in Northumberland the other day, which was, managing much better. It had a much more settled population. So it wouldn't be true to say that, every prison is like, for instance, HMP Winchester, which was shown, which is a very violent place, very lot of self-harm, very poor staff morale, all of those sorts of issues. But on the other hand, I think that was a fair description of that prison, and I don't think that prison is unique. And I think when people say there is a crisis in the prison system, that's correct.
And that's ongoing, isn't it? That's been going on for some time.
Very classic. I think there's a sort of, in my view, it's quite important. And even if you look at what's happening at Winchester, I think in all of these situations, it's very tempting and easy to blame the individuals on the ground. Why did that staff member not deal better with that prisoner who is having a psychotic fit or whatever it might be? And I think that's to a large extent very unfair. The problems in the prison system are absolutely the result of massive staffing cuts, much greater than any other part of the public sector, and very misguided policy initiatives that came from the top. And I think, there's I think sometimes an easy attempt to shift responsibility for what's happening downwards to the people who are working on the front line. And sometimes mistakes are made, but that's not fair. This is a political and policy crisis, not one that's down to some, about uncaring individual staff, I don't think.
Yeah, and I've done quite a bit with probation, one section of probation from one of the CRCs, 2 of the CRCs actually, and I'm in conversation with a prison about looking at a trauma-informed approach for staff, and for obviously how that will filter through the whole system. But I'm wondering, you're saying you had a look at Northumberland. What do you think makes a prison a better prison, a more manageable prison than, say, Winchester?
I think you need to be really clear that even being in the best prison is a very severe punishment indeed. So prisons are really grim places, and I've been to pretty much every prison in the country and a lot abroad, and I've yet to find any holiday camps. Prisons are, they're very severe punishment. So you can have a view about whether the length and whatever of that punishment is necessary, but don't pretend somehow it's an easy ride. It's not. And the key, to make them work, are the very basics. They have to be safe. And to make them safe, you need enough staff to run them properly and to manage kind of behavior before it gets out of hand. And people need stuff to do. They need something that's productive and purposeful, and they need to be held in conditions that are decent, not luxurious, but just not filthy and rat infested, and not, as you saw again in that program, and treated with a modicum of respect by staff. And the prison I was in, they were kind of pulling off. It was great, but they were delivering that. People were busy and occupied. I think that was key. In Winchester, people were locked in their cells for 22 hours a day and in squalid conditions. So it wasn't really. It's not surprising. Excuse me, but it's not surprising that people certainly were using drugs on a large scale to kind of blot some of that out. And it's not surprising that sometimes that frustration boiled over into violence. And then, of course, for the staff, I think you're right about. I'm very interested about this informed approach for staff. I think for some of these jobs, we don't think carefully enough about the impact of those sorts of conditions on the staff involved. We don't. So, for instance, I think sometimes both in policing and prisons, we forget that staff get frightened. Right? And how does that then affect their behaviour, their willingness to stuck in? It's much easier sometimes if you're a prison officer and you see something that might be a bit of trouble down the end of the corridor. Do you walk down on your own and have a look? Or do you not notice and go off in the other direction? And I think it's easy to sort of point the finger and say they should do this and they should do that. But that's very difficult. And you saw again in that television program, if people are feeling anxious about their own personal safety, then it's very difficult for them to develop the kind of relationships with prisoners or the other people who they might be dealing with. That kind of fear and wariness gets in the way. So I think I think there's a lot to understand about how those sorts of conditions impact on staff, just as much as we try to understand how they're impacting on prisoners.
Absolutely. And as you quite rightly say, we all have a central nervous system. Yeah. And we've seen in that programme, watching people have their own reactions and their own responses and their own reflections and fears and anxieties. And also there'll be people in that prison who, have come into that service from their own experience. They've had their own experiences that create the lens and the way that they view the world. And
I also think you're asking, it's a lot sometimes. I think sometimes we're not very honest from outside the system, particularly people who are interested in reform and maybe come from progressive, about talking about some of the harm that the offences some of these guys, that is practically all men, have committed. And I think, how do you and staff will know about that? And what we ask of them is to put the offence behind them and deal with people now in a relatively non-judgmental way. And I think that's quite difficult. If, for instance, somebody's done something to a child, you have your own children, actually dealing with that person then while they're in your custody in a fair and decent way is quite a hard thing to do, I think. And if you hear a lot about, not just, this isn't just uniform staff, you think about the psychologists, the other healthcare staff, and for instance, you're hearing a lot about the offences people are committing. I think that's quite wearing in a way. And again, that has an effect on people.
I think where I've seen that done well is Grendon.
Yes, it does. Grendon is a very good example of where it's basically what they call a therapeutic prison. And that works, I think, for both staff and prisoners.
Yes.
But it's very staff intensive. It's quite selective about who they take at Grendon, so it's not easy. My point, I think, is that that sometimes this goes back to my role as Chief Inspector. I think it's quite easy to criticise any of these institutions from the outside, and I think that we are actually we need to we need to make a distinction between people abusing their powers or neglecting their responsibilities, and people trying to do a very difficult job and sometimes not bringing it off. They aren't the same thing.
Yeah, and I guess the real challenge in the whole prison agenda, of course, is that it's always going to be intensely political in terms of whether it's sold as. I mean, we heard Priti Patel talk about terror. She used the word terror, which I thought was very telling and embedded in a very particular ideology about crime and about them and us, the public, and safety, and we will be the harshest we can possibly be. I mean, we're always going to be somewhere on a spectrum with that, aren't we? I guess.
Yes. I think it's, first of all, I think it's really important that we don't dismiss so out of hand people's fear of and concerns about crime. Actually, crime, a lot of what we think about crime is not true. Actually, crime impacts most heavily on the most disadvantaged communities. It's not, I'm statistically unlikely to be a victim of crime, but if you live on a, very deprived estate and you've got with very poor community facilities, you're much more likely to be a victim of crime. And even minor crime, if you're an older person and starting to be scared to go out of your flat, then that has a big impact on your life. So we shouldn't underestimate the impact of crime. But I think the idea that somehow or other, simply by being tougher, we can reduce crime is simply not true. There is, sometimes if you look, for instance, at young people who are involved in kind of gang violence, for instance, there is nothing that we as the state could do to them that would be worse than what they're prepared to do to each other, what they're prepared to risk. If you look at kind of that, and particularly if you talk about young people, what's really clear is, you will see some, the end product, some sort of violent incident, but actually that is just a very consistent pattern which for that young person started from child. They've seen their mum knocked about. They themselves have been bashed. They were bullied at school. They were a bully at school. They've been involved, they've been victims of crime, they've been perpetrators of crime. So by the time they get to whatever it was that brings them into custody, for them that's not often some aberration. That's just part of consistent with a pattern of the violence they've been exposed to and involved in since they were tiny children. And it's true, I think, that I do think we have to deal with crime as it presents now. You have to deal with it now, but actually, the cliches are true. If you don't start, helping young people at a much earlier age and trying to deal with some of the causes, much earlier, you're not going to be successful in addressing this.
You're slightly older than me, Nick, and I sometimes feel frustrated because that's been very much part of my work. All my career has been about earlier intervention, trying to break the cycle, and there were many people before me and there'll be many people after me. I mean, how do you feel, before we sort of head back to the 80s, how do you feel across that span of many decades in terms of progress and frustration, or do you feel you've achieved something and you've got somewhere, or do you think it is just about continually passing the baton on to the next people?
No. I think that's no. I don't think that. I think there've been some full of problems. Prisons are now better now than they were 30 years ago. And that's true of lots of things. I think. I'm very clear. I think that people. You can't put none of us can put the world to rights, but we can make a difference for individuals. There's a lovely. I had a very lovely when I worked at the Refugee Council. I had a chair who had come over. It was a Asian which is I think of Indian heritage, but who came originally, had come over with the refugees from Uganda. Her family had, and she told me a story from that part of the world, and it was, you may have heard it. There's been a sort of beach in Africa, and there's been a terrible storm overnight, and thousands of fish have been washed up onto the beach and are lying along the tide line, sort of flapping and dying in the sun. And there's a boy on the beach, and he's picking up the fish one by one by their tails and throwing them back in the sea. And an old man's watching him, and after a while he says, "You stupid boy, what difference do you think you can make?" And the boy picks up another fish and he throws it back in the sea, and he says, "Made a difference to him." And I think there's something around, I wouldn't, of course I haven't solved some of these deep-seated social and economic problems, but I think the work that we did in lots of these organisations made a difference to lots of individuals, and I think that was worth doing.
Oh, I love that. And, fits in with my one connection at a time, creating social change, one connection at a time. So we're definitely in agreement on that one. But I just want to take us back to the 80s, because I hadn't seen you for years and years and years, and saw you on Twitter, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, and wrote to you and felt very much that you probably just didn't remember me. And we said hello. But anyway, that was the end of it. And then a year later, it was last year, was it the 50th anniversary? Yeah. So the 50th anniversary of Centrepointe. And they were looking for staff who'd worked in Centrepointe, young people who'd been in Centrepointe, and of course, Nick Hardwick, who was the CEO at that time. In fact, I think they got involved with a number of CEOs across that 50-year period. And so we met up again and had a really quite interesting conversation about the 80s, because of course that's where we first met, when I was a 17-year-old homeless in central London and staying at the night shelter, which was then on Shaftesbury Avenue. And what kind of came out of that conversation really was, I suppose, a kind of real reflection about homelessness in central London in the 80s and what that looked like. And we were sort of trying to figure out, what does it look like now? Has it changed? But can you just kind of describe your time there, around the time that I was there, from your eyes and your perspective?
Well, I think that, you'll remember that. I mean, basically at that point, Centrepointe consisted of a night shelter, which was in a crypt of St Anne's Church in Soho, a longer stays a hostel called Centrepointe House, and some flats and bedsits. But for the night shelter, I mean, the way it worked is that young people, this was, children, these were 16 to 18, most of them, would queue up on outside the gate on Shaftesbury Avenue, which I think you can sit behind a shop now, but you can just about see it if you know what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. And the gate would open at 8. The place was staffed by volunteers, so we couldn't open till 8 because people came in from work, got the place ready, and then they would talk to people in this queue at the gate. Some people would be expecting, some people like you the first time would be new. We'd kind of take them in. There were 2 dormitories downstairs and a sort of common room area upstairs. People could stay a couple of weeks, and they had to go at 8 in the morning. And so it was kind of very basic. But that's all there was for. There wasn't anywhere else that people could go. And I think what people now forget is how dangerous and seedy that part of central London kind of was for young people. Even at the time, I think it's very important to resist the glamorization of it. That there were boys and girls who were caught up in prostitution, which was coercive. It wasn't something they had choices about, which was coercive. There would certainly be people preying on people, young people as they arrived, for instance, to the mainline station. People would be trying to pick them up. Would be offering them basically accommodation in return for sex. That would be it, and pressurizing people, and there was a lot of violence around, and it was, we were at the time very conscious if we couldn't get people in, if we turned people away because we were full, we were turning them into a very dangerous situation. There was the idea that you could kind of contact social services and they would do something, or that you could, tell the police about what was going on, was for the birds. That wasn't true. Mm. And the other thing that's important, certainly in the light of what's happened, we did a lot of work to expose the fact that about 1 in 3 of the young people we came to us had come from children's homes, from the care system. And at that time, it was often children's homes they were running away from. And we knew they had good reason to run away from some of these places because we had so many consistent accounts. But there wasn't, and we tried to protect them as best we could from that and try to find them alternatives. But there weren't, there was not at that time authorities you could go to who could say, look, we've got a safeguarding issue here. They were just not, people were just not listening. And it was a very dangerous time for young people. And we were lucky that there were people at Centrepointe who said, like, volunteers were coming from work, they'd work through the night pretty much, maybe get a couple of hours kipping on the floor and then go off to work the next day. So
and they were amazing. I mean, charities, I was one of those children that came out of the care system into homelessness, and charities saved my life. Charities altered the trajectory of my adult life, a number of them, and Centrepointe was one of the first.
Yes. I think there were a lot that time, and I think it's too easy to, I'm sure we got lots of stuff wrong, and I think if you looked at some of our practice then, that wouldn't be kind of acceptable today in terms of sort of risk or whatever, but I think it was, I think the work it did at that time and the people who set it up and whatever, it was crucial.
And my memories of that time, and the fact that I even have memories of that time, I think is testament to those people having had only 2 weeks there, essentially. I remember the food, I remember that 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. shift. I remember because it was winter, I remember being out all day with my lunch and vouchers, buying fags.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we gave you lunch and vouchers, didn't we?
Yeah, and we all just bought cigarettes.
People know what lunch and vouchers are now. Maybe you need to explain lunch and vouchers.
This is very true. They were worth 55 pence. It was 1987. They were worth 50. The fact I can even remember this, I find phenomenal. 55 pence, and you could use that to go and purchase your lunch. So you'd have a breakfast in the morning, and you'd go back to this absolutely hearty, freshly prepared, home-cooked food. And I'm a bit of a foodie. Even in my hour of desperate need, the quality of food was very important to me. And I just kind of remember that memory coupled with the sexual exploitation of young people. Those are the two things that I really remember. And I remember them because I remember, as I said to you when we spoke earlier this year, it was the boys that I remember. I remember the boys being sent into the hostel to recruit more boys.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, I was very fortunate in that seemed to be what people who were sexually exploiting young people were looking for boys.
Well, I think they would also, as now, prey on the most vulnerable. If they thought, you were a bit feisty and gobby.
Do you think I was, though, Nick?
Well, I can come to that. I think you were. I think you probably would not have been, put it this way, they wouldn't have identified you as a soft touch, I think. Whereas, it was the ones who looked more vulnerable, who were more vulnerable, that were more immature, that were more likely to be, were at greater risk, I think.
And I was very vulnerable. I don't dispute that at all. I was a 17-year-old homeless girl in the middle of central London. But you're absolutely right. There was definitely, I remember shouting at a blue metallic Jag. I mean, I don't know what these memories have done in my brain over the years, but I remember a metallic blue Jaguar, and I remember running down the road shouting at this guy, okay, maybe screaming, and there was an off in it, because he was, trying to recruit boys out of the hostel. And so you're right about that.
And I think that's as I say, it felt like a very dangerous environment. As you say, people were out during the day in weathers. There were places that they could go, like to New Horizon, which is a day centre. There was like advice centres and stuff they could go to, but people were on the edge, really.
Yeah. And then a couple of years after that, you decided that I would be a good media face for Centrepointe, and I ended up doing quite a few bits and bobs for you. I specifically remember the conversation on the Channel 4 news programme with Jon Snow, which we went on with Sheila McKechnie from Shelter. And
I think, one of the things that we were very keen to do at Centrepointe at that time was to use our experience to try and influence policy on these matters. So I think, one of the successes I think Centrepointe had is I think we did successfully raise the issue about the numbers of young people who were coming from children's homes, and I think we were instrumental in the beginnings of the reform of that process. And the other thing we did, I think it was unusual for its time, was we got young people to speak for themselves. Nowadays the idea about getting that user voice would be, that's what you have to do when we do that. But at that time, the idea that we would get you, one of the people who actually used Centrepointe, the idea that you might have something to say about the situation, that you might have something to contribute, was a pretty radical idea that people thought was a bit stupid. So that there wasn't an easy, it wasn't about you personally, just people didn't use their service users in that way. There wasn't like that, and I think that was pretty groundbreaking and good. And credit to Channel 4 and Jon Snow. He was, who's always had a long-term interest in this issue, was keen to kind of cooperate with that. And I think that was very powerful, because I think, just as we were saying about prisoners earlier, people had an image and a stereotype of what homeless people were like, and at that time it was, old guys with a bottle of meths and a long straggly beard, and there were you, 17, and you were homeless, and that was, very powerful testimony you gave.
Yeah, and you've touched on something really important, really, which is about that whole lived experience voice being central to services, and it is frightening listening to lived experience. There's no question about that. I've looked back on the video, and the whole sea of faces staring at me in disbelief, like, who is this person? How dare she come on this programme? Almost certainly. The bishop looked absolutely horrified at me.
I think he tried to patronise you very much and wasn't entirely successful in his attempt, I think. But there's a sort of, and that was, obviously we weren't the only people doing it, but that was the beginning of a time where people were saying, look, actually, and this I don't tell you, this is not simply about stuff that we do to people, it's about stuff that we do with people.
Yeah. And how amazing to be around during that period of time with all those changes and shifts and movements, that created. Centrepointe now is huge. It's a very big charity, isn't it? Yeah. Lived experience, as you say, features very much as certainly, if not successful in gathering it and using it, it's an endeavour to do so, which is progress. How's the homeless situation in central London now?
Well, you can see now if you go around. The homeless situation is very, very bad. I think it's different in some ways. I think what's happening with young people in particular, they're not as visible as they were. That doesn't mean they're not homeless. It just means that they're experiencing different ways. So you'll get a lot more people in squats, sleeping on friends' floors, that kind of stuff, shifting from place to place, rather than actually being on the streets. We know I'm involved in New Horizon, as you said. Now lots of people, for instance, will get on a night bus for the night or whatever. I think partly policing. Actually, being on the streets is more difficult, but that doesn't mean that people have a roof over their head they can go back to night after night. So it's different. I think like the dangers are different too. So there wasn't. I don't think there's the same issue of sexual exploitation to the same extent, but you have the kind of gang violence and stuff that's happening, which is different as well. So I think there are different issues. And where people are coming, maybe it's not very different. When I was at Centrepointe, you had loads of people coming down to London from Scotland and from Ireland. Now you have people coming from East and Central Europe. I don't think it's not a big, it's not a big difference. I don't think, I suppose, in that. But it is an avoidable thing. What people forget, I think, was a period, in the early 2000s where we were successful in reducing the numbers of homeless people on the streets. You didn't see them as much. And now the numbers are shooting up again. And I think it's important to be clear that is not some inevitable consequence of the sort of frailties of the individuals concerned. That's because the government has decided to withdraw support from people who need some help to live on their own, whether because of their age or whether because of their, they've got a disability of some sort or whatever, or just bad luck. If we pulled away some of the safety nets, and as a consequence, people have crashed to the ground, and that's what we see. It's not somehow a chunk of the population has decided they'd like to spend time on the streets. We put them there because we don't offer them any other safe alternative.
And how long would it take to kind of, even if we were to have a reversal policy on that, where a government did actually want to support people who face all sorts of different vulnerabilities? We can go into some towns in the country and we have endless tents. People are actually pitching up and moving into homelessness because there is no other option.
Well, I think that there now apparently is billions of pounds to splash about. So I think we can do something. And for me, I think we do know what kind of works. I think first of all, you have to give people an alternative to the streets, even if it's pretty basic. I don't think we're long to open up some of the emergency kind of stores. Don't let the best be the enemy of the good. Give people an option to get off the streets. Once you've got them off the streets, you can start to do the work that you need to find them longer term solutions. And of course, for some people, it's about kind of the mental health or substance misuse interventions that are required. So there's some intractable problems in all of that. But we should be making a much more determined start on it, I think. And one of the things that concerns me, I think it's really important that Centrepointe saw when we were there, there was no contradiction between saying, on the one hand, we want to provide these basic services, but we also want to speak out very loudly about the causes of these things. And I think it's really important that charities don't become so dependent on government grants, they don't become so part of the machinery of government that they lose that, lose their kind of willingness to speak out about the factors that make their work necessary.
That's absolutely that central theme of activism. If you're going to work in those services, part of your role is about being activist. But yes, we know that the funding cycle is a challenge. So, Nick, what do you do now? What do you get up to on the daily?
Now I teach. I have a part-time professor at Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London. So I do all the stuff that you do. I teach and I supervise stations and I lecture. And I do a bit of research on criminal justice accountability systems mainly. And I do quite a lot of consultancy work. And I'm also chair of New Horizon Youth Centre, which is still working with homeless young people. So I still do pretty much what I was doing when we met originally.
That's fantastic. All from a third-class honours degree, hey?
Exactly. See, well, when I say that to people, I say now, like it was a sort of you can mess up, which I did, but pick yourself up and get going again. And I think that's quite, I certainly, and I talk to my students now, so look, okay, I'm not suggesting you should be a more diligent student than I was, but this bad mark on this occasion is not the end of the world. You can pick yourself up and get going again.
Yeah.
And they can, and they do.
Yeah. Indeed, with the right support. That's the key, isn't it? Yeah. With the right support. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today. And
lovely talking to you again.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, and you.